Hi, I'm Davis Pike, the guest host for Front Up as it relates to Lubec. And now I have a guest artist, a guest visitor here, Bernard Ross. And Bernard is well known to all the viewers that are from Lubec. And you can tell that he's a senior citizen. Bernard, I believe you're 87 years old, is that right?
Right.
So may we all live so long. Can you tell us a bit about your early life in Lubec, which must have been in the 1920s and 30s?
It was. I was born and brought up on a small farm in West Lubec. I have a sister and 4 brothers. And we went to a little one-room schoolhouse on the Crow's Neck Road. 1 teacher in 1 room teaching all 9 grades, all subjects. And there's been some controversy over not getting education enough, but my 3 brothers were all officers in the Air Corps, so that says a little bit about what they had for education. We had all the farm chores to do. We had horses and cattle, sheep, so forth. So we had wood to carry in, and the chores to do on the farm, the milking and all that stuff. And haying in the summertime. We had 2 barns we'd filled up full of hay each year to take care of the cattle for the winter. Yeah.
And then the winters were more severe in those days, right?
The winters were much more severe, and the upstairs in our house was not heated. So many mornings we'd wake up in the morning and the window would be completely covered with frost. And the chamber mug under the bed would be froze solid, so it was quite cold. We'd have probably 3 homemade quilts on us and blankets and so forth. And we could always count on skating for Thanksgiving. Today you're very lucky to have skating for Christmas time. And 2 years ago, Gardener's Lake didn't freeze over until February. So the winters have changed quite a bit. Father was a mail carrier.
Now tell me about that, being a mail carrier in the winter in those days.
Yeah, he had RSD number 1 out of the West Lubec Post Office that was located right on the corner of the Crow's Neck Road. So our chores in the morning was to get the horse out. He had 2 horses. He'd take the horse one day and the second horse the second day to give them a day of rest between trips, because it was a 24-mile route. And we'd get up in the morning, get our breakfast, get our chores done. We'd get the horse out and put a harness on, get the pung out of the barn and put the horse in the pung, or sleigh they also call it. We'd get the fire bricks out of the oven, wrap them up in newspaper and tie them up to put in the bottom of the pung, keep your feet warm for a while. Then he'd come out with his big long sheepskin coat with a high collar and climb in the pung, pull the buffalo robe up over him and head out. And he'd be gone all day. He'd get around the Straight Bay Run, the Crow's Neck, and Timber Cove, round to the Chapel Cemetery. And just before he came up there was a gravel pit. And that's where he'd stop and he'd feed the horse hay for dinner. And he'd sit there in the sleigh having his sandwiches and coffee in the thermos and stuff. And then continue on after dinner up and go in the McClellan Road and out the Wilcox Road and back to the post office. I've often thought about him in that open sleigh all day long, driving wind, below 0, and they didn't have insulated clothes back in those days.
Amazing.
Yeah.
How did the mail get delivered to him?
It came from East Machias. Manly Jestins had a little van, and he served the post offices from East Machias to Lubec with the bulk mail. And then it would be made up at each post office.
Okay. Well.
When the snows were deep for the horse, Father would get out of the sleigh and break a trail through the drift for the horse, because the horse can't struggle through the snow, the deep snow, because they have sharp shoes on so they don't slip on the ice. And when they're struggling, the hind feet will dig the back of the front feet, and and bruise the skin and cut the skin. So he'd get out and break a trail through the drift for the horse to go through. Yeah. And one time, the sleigh upset. His money box dumped all the money and the stamps and money orders all into snow. And he was pretty proud of the fact that he picked it all up, everything except 1 penny. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, now you said your early childhood was right next to the Twin Spruces, and that's Carlton Fish's Pond there, is it?
Carlton Fish's Pond.
And that was the town skating there, and a lot of people in Lubec skated quite well?
When I was a young man, there was only a pool of water, maybe 30 feet in diameter, and all the rest of the pond was floating vegetation. Cat and nine tails and cranberry vines and all that sort of thing. And sometimes when mother wasn't watching us too closely, us kids would go out on that and walk around, and as long as you moved, you was all set. But if you stopped, it would very slowly sink. And we'd watch the water coming up over our toes and our ankles and part way up our legs. And then there'd be some bloodsuckers and water beetles come, so we'd move on our way, and back it would come up again. Carlton Fish dug that all out by hand to the bigness it is now. It's probably an acre, I suppose, now. At least, maybe a little more. He had a wheelbarrow and a mattock and a pitchfork. And he'd chop that stuff up, throw it in the wheelbarrow, take it ashore and pile it up in the places that needed a little fill. And then when he got beyond reach, he'd build a raft with planks onto the raft. And he could do a semicircle of that, and then he built a second raft with the planks to it. That gave him a bigger semicircle. And then he built a third raft, and that would give him the extent he needed to do the pond.
But the point was that in the winter, that became a social center for young people in Lubec.
After he got it all finished and dammed up, it flooded more water, so it gave a big pond. And that used to be loaded with people on Saturdays and Sundays. Out there skating for pleasure, bonfire in the evening, playing Gorham and Robin Hood. You know, teams would be playing that.
Well,
yeah.
It's really interesting to have an insight into the early life of Lubec in our generations. Then you went, as you got older, you worked for Sherwood Prout, and that's a name that's important in the economic history of Lubec of the 20th century. Can you tell us a little bit about Sherwood Prout and all that he did? Because everyone always talks about the sardine industry, but not much about the farming we had.
Yeah. Sherwood Prout came from Prout's Neck, I believe it is, just beyond Portland, down around Cape Elizabeth. And he came to Lubec with the idea of starting a truck farm. When you go, anybody who's gone to Lubec, when they get about to South Lubec Corner, they run into a cold wall, cold air. And all of South Lubec and Quoddy Head has that cold air. And he leased acres and acres of land all down through there for planting lettuce and cauliflower. And the produce going into the Boston market, when it was going by, here comes Sherwood Prout from Lubec with fresh produce, because that cold kept his stuff behind. So it was quite a lot later for it to harvest. But in order to do that, he hired every kid that was in town. Little kids, big kids. The real tiny ones worked a half a day. They called them the mosquito fleet, pulling weeds and stuff. The rest of us, we planted cauliflower. He bought the Lee Myers farm. So there was a barn there. He had an ice house back of it to store winter ice in for icing the lettuce, and a greenhouse back of that where he raised his cauliflower. So I have crawled on my hands and knees for miles, seems like, because you'd have a plot of land that would be a couple of acres maybe, and it would be all plowed, and a machine would get down through to put a little trickle of fertilizer and leave a little drill. And one guy would have a tray loaded with cauliflower seedlings, and the other one would be on the hands and knees. The first guy would drop his cauliflower every 10 inches or so, and the second one coming along would just pull the dirt in on them. And when those came up to the point to where the head was about the size of a walnut, we'd go down through the cauliflower gardens again with a whole lot of rubber bands on our wrist. And we'd pull all the leaves up and put a rubber band on them. And then that way, that kept the sun off the cauliflower. So they were always pure white. With the leaves down, they turned green and all kinds of colors, but by fastening the leaves up. So then, every Sunday, when those were ready for harvest, we'd load 2 trailer trucks every Sunday morning for the Boston market. One of cauliflower, one of lettuce. We'd go down through the gardens, and we had wooden crates to put the lettuce in, and at the barn they'd be iced over to help preserve them. And the cauliflower would run through a little saw to cut the leaves off, even with the top of the head, and they'd be put in wooden boxes. And they'd leave Sunday afternoon, be in the Boston market for Monday morning. The second year I worked for him, that first load went out, and he says, "That's all mine." Every year before that, he borrowed a lot of money for his fertilizer and to pay all the kids. In Smith College in Massachusetts, every summer, those 2 summers I worked there, would have about 15 girls that would come down and stay at Cleve's Tavern in Lubec to work as farmerettes on the farms. And at the end of the first year, Governor, I can't think of his name right now, but anyway, his wife came down and worked in the field a week with us, and then had a big lobster feed at the end of the week, and that was the end of the summer for the college girls. The next year, there was another batch came in, and my job to start with that morning, every morning, was to take the truck and go downtown, get the college girls loaded up with kids, and that would be loaded with kids. And I think about that a lot today, because they'd be sitting all around that body with the legs hanging down the sides. What if somebody had sideswiped us? Of course, that was during the war years. There wasn't any gasoline to speak of, and there wasn't much traffic, so I guess it wasn't a worry. Yeah.
That's quite a story. So he had a market niche by being basically a month later than everyone else.
Yeah.
And then he was very successful, but he overexpanded, did he? What happened after just those 2 vegetables? Then he went on into other things, right?
He went on into other things. But gradually, refrigeration was part of what licked him. They could bring produce in from California in a lot of places, and under refrigerator, cooling, and have fresh vegetables later on in the year as well. So he dropped out of that. He did some potato farming, and then he went into raising chickens.
So basically, the vegetables were put out of business by technology in California.
That's my understanding of it, yeah.
Okay, but then the chickens, which is, remember, a lot of Lubec went into chickens, and then that ended. What was the chicken?
About everybody had a chicken house. He was huge with thousands of chickens in them. Some were raising eggs, some were raising them for broilers. Yeah, there was a lot of those hen houses around. And that's when Sherwood Jr. became involved. He was old enough then, and he was involved with the chicken business. And that's about the time that Sherwood no longer did that sort of thing. He bought the land over in Jonesboro where Jimmy Prout is. Jimmy Prout is one of his sons as well, that has Bluebird Farm, the Bluebird Restaurant.
Very, very popular in Machias,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
So then the chickens also couldn't compete, I guess, with eggs from other places, and basically keeping the market was a problem, and the market went south, I guess.
That's what happened, and all those chicken houses filled with chickens still needed grain to eat. Yeah. And there was no money coming in from the eggs or broilers. Well, it just folded.
Now, it's interesting where the grain came from. It came up by train, and can you tell us where the grain went?
Over in Dennisville, Jimmy Prout had storage facilities over there for grain, and the grain would come in on trains to Dennisville. Then he had tractor-trailer units that hauled that grain to the various hen houses, where a blower would blow that grain into the storage bins that looked like silos. Then they automatically fed grains into the troughs down through the hen houses to feed the chickens automatically.
Okay. Now that's kind of 20th century history. Let's go into early 19th century history when the British attacked Lubec. I think you know a bit about that in the War of 1812. What can you tell us about Lubec under attack by the British?
Well, the story goes that after they captured Eastport, some of the troops, they had Eastport, I believe, for 4 years.
Right, 1814 to 1818.
Yeah. But anyway, some of them went to Lubec to capture Lubec as well. And they landed in what we know now as Globe's Cove and started up the neck. They were fired upon, and one was wounded. They carried him back to David Yeaton's, Copley Yeaton's place, right. Hopley Yeaton's. And the lady telling the story was a 10-year-old girl at the time, and she could remember seeing bones sticking out his leg when they rolled the stocking down. So then they proceeded again up to North Lubec, and they got up to Mill Cove, and there was a bunch of North Lubec men all hidden behind the ledges, and they fired upon them again, and they killed 4 British soldiers and wounded 4. And so then the British turned around and they took their wounded back. The 4 that were killed were buried there on Mill Cove. Nobody knows for sure exactly where they were, where they are. The older guy that knew where they were passed away before he got a chance to tell people. But anyway, they proceeded back part way and they were fired on again, and another was wounded. And that appears to be possibly French privateers, because there were 3 vessels anchored there, the French privateers, and the British burnt them on the way up through. Yeah, so then they retreated and they never bothered to come back again after that episode.
So that's interesting. That's why Lubeck stayed free.
Possibly, yeah. It wasn't that they were better than Eastport in repelling the British, but Eastport was outnumbered because there were so many of them came in, of course, on the ships.
And Treat Island had no great part of that fight in 1812?
Not that I know of. There is a fort on there that had a cannon, but I think that was the border war a little later, because the border wasn't officially established between the U.S. and Canada at that time.
Right.
British claimed land even as far as the Penobscot River, Castine, and down that way they took possession of Castine. And the American fleet that was down there fled up the river, and then they sunk all their ships up near Bangor, so the British wouldn't get them.
Well, I think we can talk forever on this subject, but we'll have to have that on another segment. But Bernard, I want to thank you for joining us, and I'm sure a lot of people will be interested in what you said. Okay. So thank you all, and good night from